Sounds good.
Front row, great. I like it. Oh, you full ink on that printout.
Did I get you a coffee earlier today?
How's it going?
Is he here?
How's everyone doing? Braving the cold, I like it. I like it. All set? So we're back for another class with me. Sorry for the last few. I'm just kidding. But today we have a topic that I title Why Christianity: An Apologetic Approach. And so before I dive into sort of the main sections or categories that I have for you today, I first want to offer up a few reasons why I am doing this particular class first in a series that we're about to do. So the first reason that I have for you is my wife requested it. And as a good husband, I obliged that request, and she's laughing at me right now. But it wasn't just a toss in the air, Ryan, do this for me. It actually had a good foundation on why she wanted me to do this class. Because in the series that I'm going to be going into next, we're going to be tackling a lot of topics and objections to the Christian faith that I think we all need to be prepared to have responses for and to look diligently into when it comes to the questions that when you talk to non-believers, whether it be on social media or in person, I often hear, and I'm sure the more and more you talk to non-believers, you will hear questions on these topics that we are going to discuss in the upcoming months. The second main reason why I did this class is I am personally concerned, statistically, for the body of Christ in America. I truly am. For those who don't know, my doctorate is on Gen Z and younger, and if you want to look my name up, you can get a whole sort of survey of all the statistics from last year all the way going to the 70s on what is happening to Christianity in America. Let me just give you a handful of these statistics that you will find. In the recent Pew study, they measured in 1972, 90% of Americans identified as being affiliated with, holding to, or identifying to the Christian belief. Now, that could be Catholic, that could be Protestant, that could be non-denominational, but they attached themselves to the fact that they identified with the Christian belief. In 2020, only 64% did. That's about 10% every decade drop of Americans identifying as Christians. Now, there's two main reasons that the Pew Research study has found. The first is a category called the rise of the nuns. Has anyone heard about that before? Now, there's some great research on this. It's people who are, in a sense, spiritual, but don't belong to any specific religious belief whatsoever. They just feel some spiritual connection with people and some force or earth, a lot of pantheistic or panentheistic sort of views on how spirituality actually works. The second is the rise of other religions in America. And this is exponentially happening, and I will tackle a majority of these in these classes. We see this also happening in the UK, such with Islam. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the news and what's happening with the growth of Islam over in the UK. It's happening here as well, and that is a topic I'll be covering in depth quite a few times in these classes. Third, in this study, Pew pushed the statistics and said if it stays the same, by 2070, they don't even think Christianity faith is truly going to be measurable. That's not that far away. If they keep exponentially growing, those who identify as Christians, they don't even think they'll be able to measure it in the percentage or a percent. They're going to have to go in the tenths and hundredths of a percent if it continues along the way. In fact, in some other studies, Barna and One World Studies, there was a rise up to 62% of adult Americans that think all religions lead to the same place. That counts all the beliefs, Christians, the nuns, atheists, agnostics, whatever it is, all will lead to the same place. I'm also concerned for the younger generation when it comes to the holding to the Christian belief. In 2021, Barna study finds that among young adults who do not belong to church, there are some phrases used to describe the church in general. 91% called it anti-homosexual, 87% called it judgmental, 85% hypocritical, and 78% old-fashioned. They have just done a study, and they state 1 in 3 believers who are baptized, small group, gone to church since their entire lives, 1 in 3, once they hit college, walk away from their faith. 1 in 3, 33%, according to last year's study. That's a lot, right? That's not a good statistic. They also find that the younger generation believes that just sharing your own personal testimony isn't sufficient to believe something to be true. They don't. They say, oh, that's great for you, and this could be great for this person, but why should I believe that this thing you're telling me is true is objectively true? Let me just give you an example. They throw the belief of the Jehovah's Witness at you, right? There's this thing that the Jehovah's Witness teach called the burning in the bosom. How do you know that what you are reading is actually true? Well, you will feel a burning in a bosom, and that's how you know that what you are reading is true. They make their objective claim in a subjective realm. It's a very bizarre sort of argument for the belief that something is indeed true. Now, don't get me wrong. I think every single one of us who are Christians should have their personal testimony ready to go, right? Ready to go. But personal testimony, and I see this a lot, especially where I came from, there's an encouragement like this is all you need to present. But in fact, I think it is a both-and type situation. You need to be able to give your experience of the Lord as well as objective reasons from reality of why things are true. So not just to show it's tangibly true, but it's also true of the evidence that we find to persuade the younger generations that are coming up through the church. And let me just give you the third reason. It's this. We are commanded in Scripture to be able to give reasons for the hope that we have. It's not just a suggestion. It's not just that it'd be good. It is, in the Greek, an imperative, meaning it is a divine command that we must have reasons for the hope that we have and why we believe particular things. We see it all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. Let me just give you 3 categories that we find throughout the Old Testament. The first is a defense of God by man. The second is a tangible collaboration. And the third is a defense by God himself. If you want more information on lots of examples in the original language and stuff like that, you can, if you just type in Ryan Willert, Liberty, I have a whole section on my doctorate work all arguing this to be true. It would take a whole class in itself, so I saved you guys a lot of annoyance to not do that. Second is this. We see it all throughout the New Testament. 1 Peter 3:15, Philippians 1:16, and my favorite, 2 Corinthians 10, 1 through 8, particular 1 through 18, particular 1 through 8. Let me read you what Paul says to the church in Corinth, and I love what he does here. 2 Corinthians 10, 1 through 8, it says this. I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, how he does it. I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I am away. I beg of you that when I am present, I might not have to show boldness with such confidence, as I count on showing against some who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war against the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine powers to destroy strongholds. We all are familiar with this, right? Now the next logical question is, Paul, what are these weapons? You just told me what they are. Listen to what Paul says that in the very next verse. We destroy arguments in every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. He says we are waging a battle, a war that's not of the flesh, and we have weapons. And he says what we do is we destroy intellectually every argument against the knowledge of God and take every thought that we have captive to Christ. Paul says to fight a lot of these battles that are spiritual, we have to use our minds and argumentations to be able to do so. Fascinating. Right? That's quite interesting. Dr. Moreland writes this: at the core of a maturing Christian life lies the intentional, steady development of confidence in God and the Bible based on knowing why we believe what we believe. Over and over and over again, we are told, guys, be able to share what God has done for you, but also realize that if Christianity is true, all of reality will point to its truth. Be able to show how that is the case. And so, here's my underlying intent for the talk today. I'm going to talk why I am a Christian in a world of so many different belief systems. I'm going to go through these belief systems as the months continue and look through all of them and how to compare and contrast and why Christianity is true. But what I want to do, I want to do my best in the time that I have to prepare you guys that if you are ever asked this question, whether it be at Starbucks or in church or just in a friend group or on social media, why you believe what you believe. Not only can you share what God has done for you, but you will have a program, a pattern, a plan, or a layout, step by step, of the major categories that you can go, let me tell you why I think Christianity is true. Boom, 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 right? Here are some categories to show an advanced mere Christianity, as C.S. Lewis calls it, and then briefly look at more depth in each topic so that you can have something in your back pocket that you can memorize, that you can, if someone asks you who are Christian, you can take it out and go, hey, let me teach you how you can answer this question to people who ask you why you believe what you believe. That sound good? Mm-hmm. So I have a few disclaimers before I go into it. The first is this. I'm going to briefly cover the topics. Each topic in each section can be its own talk in itself. We can do that if you guys want to do that. But I just want to go through them so that you can prepare to go a little under the surface and a little bit farther. If someone asks you more questions, then, okay, that's a great category, tell me more. Just a quick tell me more type thing. The second is this. I'm not taking what is called a presuppositional method. Has anyone heard that before? So, a lot of times in presuppositional apologetics or methodology, you have to assume Christianity is true in order for them to believe it to be true. I'm not going to do that. You kind of wind yourself in some circular arguments if you do that. I am going to always hold in the background that Christianity is true, and I believe that we have Scripture and God's words and all the truths of Christianity. But when I'm meeting someone who's not a believer, I'm going to do my best to meet them where they are and look through the lens of how they're viewing things, through their reasoning, through their logic, to get them to where I want them to be so that they can come to the truth of it and not just go, oh, sorry, you can't believe it because you don't believe it's true. Like, that's not a good argument. And I've heard people say that before. The reason why you don't believe Jesus is because you're not a Christian. I'm like, well, yeah. Thanks. That's done nothing. It's like when people go, well, I believe the Bible's God's word. Well, why? Well, because it's Scripture. Well, why is it Scripture? Because it's God's word. It's like, wait. You kind of, can you get me to that from a vantage point of a non-believer on how they can arrive at the fact that what we do, my goodness, is actually what God wanted us to know of what He wanted to say to the world. The third disclaimer is I'm taking a classical approach versus a cultural approach. The classical approach is very mere Christianity type methodology. A cultural approach is attacking sort of events in people's lives, whether it be good things or bad things, and more of a show that God is good and beautiful. And that's a wonderful approach, depending on the person. That's a great approach, especially if you're talking to a believer who is struggling. I like more of the classical approach, just because that's what I was trained in, as well as sometimes we don't agree on the same definition of good and beautiful. So we have to start from the foundation and work our way to a common ground definition. Now, once again, it depends on who you're talking to, right? And I believe since each individual ever here is called to be the fisher of men, good fishermen know which bait to use. They do. And lastly, I think Christianity is a cumulative case. I'm telling you from all my work I've done, there is not one argument that's going to prove all categories true. Right? I'm not going to give you an argument for God's existence, and because of that, you know this is David's temple. It just doesn't work like that. And so once you look through all different fields, and you realize, my gosh, like Christianity shows this is right, and my goodness, this one, Christianity shows this is right, and all of a sudden you start realizing the case that Christianity is true is a cumulative case, and you keep adding the weight and weight on top of it, it becomes incredibly powerful to show why Christianity is true once you start adding more and more layers on top of it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Awesome. So, now that's out of the way. Here are the three main categories for the talk I will be giving today. The first is that God exists. The second is that Jesus rose from the dead. And the third is we can historically trust the Gospels. Now, I'm not just going all the Bible or just all the New Testament. I want to just, for the sake of time, just concentrate on the Gospels, right? Because as much as I go, wow, the historicity of the Gospels is incredible, if we look at Paul's writings, I think it's even more incredible what we know from Paul's writings. Like, it's fascinating what we know. But I want to show that the historicity of the apostolic testimony of Jesus and what he said and what he did is historically reliable, and we can trust what we have as what they actually wrote down and believed. That sound good? Mm-hmm. So let's talk God exists. I want to run through quickly my favorite three arguments to show you why I believe God exists. The first one is called the Kalam cosmological argument. Everyone in my family is smiling at me because they know I specialize in that one. The second one is called the moral argument. And the third is the fine-tuning argument. And don't worry, I will break these down. I will walk through them, how to look at them, how to explain them. Just stick with me here. The Kalam cosmological argument. Now these three arguments are going to be laid out in what is called a deductive form. Now deductive form sounds fancy, but it's really easy to understand. And it's this. You have two premises, 1, 2, and a conclusion. If the premises are right, are true, or most likely to be true, you should believe the conclusion. Now we all use this in our everyday life. Let me give you a very elementary example of exactly what it is. I'm going to give you the two first starting lines and premises, and I want you to give me the conclusion, right? A equals B, B equals C. That's all a deductive argument is. If this is true and this is true, this necessarily has to be true. And it's not like, well, it's not. No, it logically follows from a deductive argument, the conclusion necessarily has to be true. And so here's the Kalam, ready? It states this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Oh, shoot. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Real simple, right? Now, what I love about this is this. This is a theologically neutral argument. I didn't mention God in there whatsoever. All I'm trying to show is that the universe had a cause of its existence because it began to exist. And from there, you'll see what I can get that from the first cause or the cause of what the universe would be. It's very, very fascinating. And so, let's talk about the premise one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Let me give you two reasons why I think this is true. The first is this. Empirical evidence. I can't tell you anything in all my research in science or in any level that we have causes that effects that do not have a cause. In fact, all of science causal principles work off of this being true. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Our science works like this. Even if you want to go to the strange quantum level, vacuum fields, guess what? It's still a vacuum. If you look at like a Higgs boson, right, where it tells you the mass of the particle, guess what? There's still a field there. there is nothing that we know of that when something comes into existence, there wasn't a cause related to it. We just don't know of anything. So our empirical evidence shows us that we should believe that premise 1 is true. Reason number 2, if it's not true, we have to be willing to accept very, very weird things to happen. Strange, bizarre consequences. Robert Koons writes this. He goes, there are severe, what he calls epistemological cost, or meaning this, cost in our ability to know. He says, if there are uncaused origins, meaning things can just go boop into existence out of nothing. He goes, for instance, the scenario that we've all heard of, where the universe appeared 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. Have you heard that before? If premise 1 is false, we have to be willing to accept this as a possibility, and we can't know anything about their past history because it just appeared this way. Think about this. Are your parents really your parents? Or did you guys pop into existence 5 years ago with the fake memories in your head of the history that you had? I don't know, that's a live possibility. If we deny premise 1, you have to allow these things. How are we going to know a lot of things? The sheer amount of skepticism is crazy if we're willing to accept things just pop into existence out of nothing. And I love what William Lane Craig says. Why don't we just find things doing this all the time all around us? I don't know about you, I have not seen one ever peer-reviewed journal saying, yeah, this unicorn randomly popped into existence next to me. I mean, I would love this as an excuse. If all of a sudden a new sneaker showed up in my door, my wife's like, where did these come from? Honey, listen, I don't know. They just popped in. She would do that with clay. Where did you get this 1,000 pounds of clay out? Brian, I'm telling you, it was bizarre. It just was there. Well, guess what? We can check our credit card. Right? Think about this. I could be driving down the road and a horse randomly appear in my back seat out of nowhere. What is stopping this from happening? You can't say laws, because before the universe there was no laws. So what is then stopping this? It seems this is a live possibility. The consequences are absolutely bizarre if we deny that first principle. Not only do we have no scientific evidence for it, the consequences are just absolutely weird, and we have to fall into skepticism, which I think we can know things. So that's premise 1, why we should think it's true. 2, premise 2, the universe began to exist. Right? There are 2 parts to this. The first is my favorite, what is called the philosophical arguments. Now, I love concentrating on this. It's very fun to think about. And here are a few arguments. I just want to go over one for you. The philosophical arguments have a long history, like a 1,000-year-old history, showing that we can't actually have infinities, actual infinities in reality. And if we can't have actual infinities, you can't say the universe has infinitely existed. And so let me just give you one of the arguments that was given way, way, way back by Al-Ghazali in the medieval times. He says this. Premise 1. An event collected by successive addition can never reach infinity. Like if I asked you, I want you to start and just keep counting to infinity. Count by billions, count by millions, count by trillions. Tell me when you're going to get to infinity. By definition, you will never get there. Now, let me ask you another question. When I talk about the past, how is the past formed? Now you might think, well, we take the present, the moment we're in, and count backwards. That's not actually how the past is formed. Think about this. If I want to go to next Tuesday, what do we do? Well, we take today. We add Wednesday. We add Thursday. We add Friday. We are, by successive addition, adding on days to get to the next present moment. So if you can't, by successive addition, ever count to infinity, and the past is a collection by successive addition, how in the world can you say the past has eternally existed? Somewhere in the past, things had to come into existence. Right? And there's a whole lot of nuance in these arguments and abstract objects, all that fun stuff, and philosophy of mathematics. Love that stuff. But that's just philosophical considerations. There's a lot of arguments philosophically against the past being eternal, that we can never arrive at any moment in history. It's very fascinating, these arguments.
If the past is eternal, then where does God fit into all that, knowing that he is eternal?
Oh, we'll get there.
All right.
We will get there. She's jumping ahead of the gun. The next is the scientific considerations to think the universe began to exist. First is the argument from the expansion of the universe. Every plausible model we have, whether it be weird bounce theories, whatever the case is, every plausible model always shows that there's a beginning of the universe. It just does. There are a lot of weird things out there that don't entail the beginning, but they actually don't work given a lot of the math that we have. And I could do a talk on that stuff. That's fun. The second is this, an argument from thermodynamics. Does anyone know what entropy is? It's basically a disorder in the system. And has anyone heard about the heat death of the universe? Let's get really pessimistic here. The heat death of the universe, as science says, is that sooner or later everything will continue to expand farther and farther away, where there will be no heat and no friction, whatever the case is, where everything just dies a cold death in about a few 10 billion years from now, whatever the estimate is. But the problem is this, that entropy is the amount of disorder in a system, meaning that when it hits that heat death, there will be the entropy will reach its max, right? It'll completely disorder, all that wonderful stuff. But according to Einstein, the universe is a closed system, meaning there's no energy coming in or out of it. But if that's the case, entropy is finite. It will be reached in a finite amount of time. But if the universe is eternal and infinite, why have we not reached it by then? We should have hit that point. Does that make sense? Like, if we're at the present moment and we reach this end of this infinity, and you're telling me before we reach the end of infinity we should have a heat death, we're in trouble. Because I don't see it. So not only are there philosophy, there's science showing that we should accept the universe began to exist. So, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began. Conclusion, the universe began to exist, right? So, what do we do with that? Well, we can ask the question, what kind of thing would need to create the universe? Before all space and time and matter, what kind of thing, what kind of cause would have to be to create the universe? Well, let me just give you 5 sort of attributes of the nature that is required in the first cause. Timeless and eternal. Exceedingly powerful, right? Created the universe. Need to be spaceless and immaterial because no space or universe existed. It needs to be necessary. And it needs to be personal. Now, I don't know about you. When I talk about a timeless, eternal, very powerful, immaterial, necessary, and personal being, first cause, I should say, when I look at Scripture, I see all of these attributes in God. Why am I weird to think that a being like God exists if this is what science and philosophy get us to be the first cause of the universe? Interesting, right? Do you have any questions on this in particular?
Does the theory of evolution, this doesn't seem like there's a creator in that, so that seems separate.
Yeah, theory of evolution is completely separate when it comes to this. This is just the beginning of the universe. It doesn't say how things played out. It's just referring to that. So let's move on to the second, the moral argument. I'm sure many of you have heard this before. The moral argument goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. And so this is premise 1. Let's talk about this for a second. Objective, meaning not our personal preference, not what culture is telling us, not just what you feel, not just what your friends say or what the government tells you. Something that is objective beyond any subjective preference. If we are to get objective, transcendent moral values and duties, Culture can't give us this, because if cultures change, then the morality can change. You don't give us this, because if your opinion changes, so can morality. The only way to get us this objective that will always be the case is that we have a transcendent thing grounding these objective moral values and duties. Right? And I don't know about you, but God fits that bill. You can't say, well, this law does, or this person does, or this culture does, because that's not objective. That's just subjective preference. But here's the kicker. Objective moral values and duties do exist. We all live our lives as this is true. We all live our lives as this is true. Now, you might go, it's my preference. I might not like it. Yeah, until I steal your stuff. You're going to want me punished, right? We all believe that if killing innocent babies for fun is objectively wrong. You just don't go, I don't like it. You actually think, I've done something wrong. We all live our lives this way. My goodness, you do something wrong to someone, and they go, how dare you do that? And it's funny, I actually had a mini debate in college about this in one of my religion classes, and some guy said, no, it's just purely subjective, and my argument was that it's not objective. And I walked up to the guy's stuff on his desk, and I threw it across the room. And he goes, what the heck was that? I go, what do you mean? What did I do wrong? He's like, well, are you going to do something about it? I go, no, that's your preference. You don't like that. I didn't do anything wrong. What law is against me? What did I morally do wrong? You just don't like it. You don't feel that way. And then he goes, okay, I think you got me on that one. I actually think you did something wrong here. Okay, objectively, yeah. Premise 2. So if God is the only ground for these things, and we believe these things are true, then we should come to the conclusion, well, we believe God exists then. Because he is the only ground for these things. The moral argument. And my last argument is called the fine-tuning argument. Has anyone heard about this? So let me read to you from Dr. William Lane Craig what the fine-tuning argument is and give you an example of what we mean by the universe is finely tuned. He states this: the fine-tuning argument is not trying to explain why this universe exists, right? That can be a Kalam argument. But why a life-permitting universe exists. See the difference there? It's not just why we exist, but why a life-permitting one does. The analogy I love to give on this is a lottery which a billion white ping pong balls are mixed together and one orange ball is thrown into the mix. Then one ball is drawn randomly from the pile. Now, whatever ball is drawn has equal probability, right? Because it's 1 in a billion. Any particular ball is equally improbable because it's a billions. But the question is, it is overwhelmingly more probable that you get a white ball. In our universe, we've drawn the orange ball. Why is it that we've drawn the orange ball? That is what the fine-tuning argument states. It's not that a universe can come into existence and that we find ourselves, but why is it the orange ball? That's extremely improbable. And I'm going to give you some statistics from this. So here's the argument. The fine-tuning of the universe can be explained by 3 things. All the fun statistics and numbers by 3 things. Necessity. And necessity basically means there's no other logical possibility it could be. It has to have been this. If you can conceive of something else, it's not necessary. That's what necessary means. There's literally no other logical possibility. It's either by chance or someone's behind it with a design. There's only 3 options that we have when it comes to it. I can't think of anyone else. The literature has no more than these 3 options. 2, it's not by necessity or chance. Conclusion, there's a designer behind it. And as Christians, we call that God, especially combined with all the other arguments, right? Let's take a look at premise 1. There is not one scientific theory, string theory, M theory, that you can't think of, that will tell you that the constants of the universe could have been something else. All of our science can go, well, yeah, sure, the galaxies could have formed in this way, right? This could have happened in this way. Every single theory gives you different possible universes that could have come out. That's what all of our scientific theories tell you. So that immediately tells me that it necessarily has to be. This is just off the table. I think it's a terrible option. You have to give me an argument why I can't think of another universe when the constants of the universe could logically and scientifically been something else. Every scientist will tell you that. What about chance? Well, this gets fun. Let me read you what Dr. Barnes writes about this. He says this: generally it starts off all right, just saying, we'll just take our chances. The probabilities here, if they are fine-tuning, thinks they are, they're not probabilities to be messed with. I don't know how much of a convinced atheist you are. You're not convinced that 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power, or 10 to the 122nd power, or 10 to the 90th power should start getting you to think about maybe the probabilities are very low. Look what Dr. Ross, and we're going to talk about this in next class about the Christian and aliens. He says this: there are 153 parameters that need to be met in order for a planet to form life. 153 parameters that we know of. Dr. Ross writes this: the probability of a planet anywhere in the universe fitting with just a planet within 153 parameters is 10 to the 193 power. The maximum number of planets in the universe are 10 to the 22nd. Listen, look how crazy this is. This is less than 1 chance in 10 to the 172 power of getting a planet to form life. That's 100,000 trillion 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 of 1%. That's on one just a planet forming life.
There aren't that many atoms in the universe.
Yeah, exactly. On top of that, now you have to get stars and explosions and galaxies and everything also to form. I mean, it's insane to think about. Now, if you were to ask me, Ryan, what percentage do you give to the fact that God exists? And I give you this of 1%, you're going to go, you're stupid. Why would you accept that probability? That's irrational to believe in, but it's okay to hold that this chance when it comes to life forming? It seems, why doesn't it work on the other side of the coin? Why isn't it irrational to think that it was by chance? And that's just the planet formation. So given the fact that necessity doesn't work, and you can still accept chance, right? Good luck with that probability. The only other third option is that God exists. There's a designer. There's a mind behind the fact that what we're experiencing and the probabilities and the chances, something is behind the scenes adding some input to it, and it seems like a very intelligent thing. So, here's the conversation I often get. Brian, why are you a Christian? Well, I think God exists. Really? Why? Well, not only do I have my personal experience, I have really good reasons to think that God exists. Okay, what are they? I think God is the best explanation for the universe coming into existence. I think God is the best explanation to ground our morals that we have. And I think God is the best explanation to explain why we see all this incredible design in the universe. Not only that, then I add the three on top of each other. That's why I think God exists. And not only that, there's about 15 other arguments I can go into. So if you're looking for the first step, I'm a Christian because I believe God exists. Here are my reasons. Not only that, I'm a Christian because I think, well, my slide's missing, Jesus rose from the dead. Historically rose from the dead, not some metaphoric, cool sci-fi, spiritual experience. He physically rose from the dead. Now, there's a very popular saying out there that states, if God exists, raising someone from the dead is just child's play. Right? The next question is, then did Jesus rise from the dead? Right? And if Jesus rose from the dead, and he said what he said, and he claimed what he did, and he believed what he did, and he predicted this, we should take him serious at what he says. So, let's take a look at why I believe Jesus rose from the dead. And one of these days, I'm going to do a multiple class on it. I love this topic. The arguments for Jesus' resurrection are now a different kind of argument. They're an argument that's called inductive. Do you guys know what that means? So inductive basically states this. We gather all the information that we can, right? Let's take this, let's take this, let's take this, let's take all the archaeology, the history, the science, philosophy, let's take it all. Let's gather all the facts that we can. And then there are hypotheses, filters you can put, right? And we want to see which of these filters, or each hypothesis, can filter the data. If all of a sudden you go, well, this one can only fit 1 in, but this one can fit 10, the one that can put 10 in is going to be the one that should be true. Does that make sense? And so, not only that, but let's talk about what makes good evidence. If I'm going too fast, you can stop me and ask questions. What makes good evidence? Because I'm going to tell you something. Man, do you know how many conspiracy theories are out there? I mean, and let's be honest, Christians, we're the worst of them when it comes to some of them. And we will throw out an argument that has like one tiny bit of evidence and go, there it is. Even though the evidence is garbage. So what makes good evidence? Well, there's 5 categories that we should look for good evidence. The first is this, explanatory scope. It looks at the quantity, the number of facts that your hypothesis can explain. Like I said, if this only fits 1 fact, but this fits 40, this one's going to have more explanatory scope than the one that fits 1. We also look for evidence that has explanatory power. It looks at the quality of the explanation, meaning less effort to try to get it to fit. Do you know how many times conspiracy theories, they say things and it feels like you're trying to shove the fact into like some small corner box and like, dude, you're trying way too hard to get that fact to work for you. That's power. If I can just go, whoop, and it slips through perfectly, that has strong explanatory power for the fact that it is. Plausibility means it's not just logically possible, but a lot of the evidence is pointing towards it. Less ad hoc, this is my favorite one, means non-evidenced assumptions. Basically stating is this. Do you know how many times I have conspiracy theories where someone goes, well, it could be this. I'm like, okay, what's your evidence? Well, I don't have it. Well, it could be that. Well, that's ad hoc. Meaning I have to make up so many assumptions, just believe certain things without evidence to think it's true. And a lot of times, this happens to Christians all the time, right? This has to be true of our lives. Well, that's ad hoc because there's no evidence. You're just assuming things and thinking it's true based off the assumptions. Why are your assumptions true? And last, illumination. It needs to provide possible solutions to a broad range of problems. It needs to shine a spotlight. Well, this solves this, this solves this, this solves this, this solves this. And if you can have a hypothesis that is all of these well and perfectly, that's going to be the thing you want to believe and hold to. And you're going to find the resurrection over all of the other arguments is going to fill out these categories perfectly with all of the historical facts that you're going to find. So what I want to do to you, I want to present something that Gary Habermas calls the minimum facts argument. The minimum facts argument. And he has just put out his opus. I love Gary Habermas. He's at Liberty University. He just put out his opus. It's going to be a 4-volume series. He's been doing this for like 50 years. That's 8,000 pages. 8,000 pages and 4,500 recorded sources from 1975 on just the resurrection and facts from archaeology and historians alone. It is incredible. It is incredible. He's the guy that Jordan Peterson just recently went to. And so he's going, let me just go the minimum facts. So let's just talk about a handful of them. The minimum facts is basically bedrock facts. Every scholar, whether it be Christian or agnostic or or atheist all agree that these facts are history. These are historical. There's no argument anymore over these facts. This is the case. These are what are called the minimum facts. Here they are. Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion. The disciples experienced the risen Lord, or they claimed to experience the risen Lord. Remember, because we were trying to see if resurrection is the answer for these things. The earliest proclamation of the gospel, which is fascinating. If you study 1 Corinthians 15, you can actually put oral traditions within 3 years of the actual event, given the language he uses. We know that the disciples had transformations in what their belief system when all evidence was against them. Sorry, all prior beliefs were against them, again, because they believed resurrection was end of days thing. The conversion of James and the conversion of Paul. These are the 6, what he calls minimum facts. He thinks within the next decade, it's possible there could be 12. I think there's going to be more than 12. I think there's some things such as the Roman guards at his tomb, or the story that the disciples said about the guards falling asleep, or Joseph of Arimathea is not on there. I think those are going to be even more. I had a 6-part argument why I think Joseph of Arimathea actually took his body, and we should consider it a minimum fact. And so the question is the hypothesis, right? I think it's true, but for those who aren't thinking, let's just propose the resurrection as a hypothesis. Well, guess what? Not only does it explain every single one of these, it shines light on every single one of them. I don't have to assume anything other than, are we trying to prove the hypothesis? It filters every single one, and it filters every single one very easily.
What makes those minimum trustworthy? Like, why is everyone agreeing that those are accurate?
Given the historical and archaeological evidence that we have, you can show that these are just bedrock facts.
Outside of Christianity?
Oh yeah, without using the Bible. You can go, hey, here's this, and here's this, here's this. This is what, like, extra biblical testimony and all that stuff. You can go, yeah. Even Bart Ehrman agrees on these things. But yeah, it is a bedrock historical facts. And so, Jesus rose from the dead as an explanation, takes all of these, what makes good evidence, and does it brilliantly. Now, let's take some other hypotheses against the resurrection and see if it can do the same thing. The first major one is that it was a legend. That this story of Jesus rising from the dead sort of was embellished and came throughout time in the 300s, 400s AD. This is sort of when the church started this. Well, there's some major problems to this. The first is this. The story can actually be traced back to the original apostles. So developing over time is historically just false. Paul came to believe in Jesus' resurrection apart from the testimony of the disciples on his road experience. Then he went 3 years later to Jerusalem to talk to Peter and James to see if his testimony matched up with their testimonies. For 3 years, he's proclaiming the same gospel that he said the Lord taught him, and they matched perfectly up with them. Not only that, James came to believe in Jesus' resurrection apart from the testimony of the disciples. And Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 show an early creed within the first 5 years of the event taking place. Now, that doesn't sound like a 300-year-old embellishment to me. It sounds like a very, very early, so legend just doesn't seem to fit the evidence that we have. Let's go through some more. What about the fraud theory? Someone stole Jesus' body. Could someone have taken his body? Well, maybe the disciples took Jesus' body. There's some problems with that. Disciples sincerely believed that Jesus rose from the dead. How do you get to that belief if you stole the dead body? You don't get to that. Not only does it not explain that, it doesn't explain Paul, who saw the risen Lord. It doesn't explain James. It doesn't explain the 500 who saw him as well. And it doesn't explain anyone's willingness to claim to die for the belief that they had if they stole the body. Who dies for a lie when you can just go back to your Jewish belief that you've always held and think is true? It makes no sense. There's no money in it. The women had to pay for the guys. There's no fame in it. They were kicked out of towns and beaten and thrown in jail. What other explanation could it be that the fact that they actually believed from very early on that they saw the risen Lord? I love the wrong tomb theory. Wrong tomb theory. Even if it's true that they went to the wrong tomb, let's just grant you that argument. Say they did go to the wrong tomb. It doesn't explain that the disciples still saw the risen Lord. They just went to the wrong tomb. Right? It doesn't explain away the facts of what we have. Not only that, we have testimony of the Gospels that the empty tomb convinced John. John ran. Actually, I love how the John says that he kind of adds an insult. He's like, yeah, I ran up ahead of everyone. Like, John, really? Really calling everyone slow? What a jab you added on that one. Mary thought the gardener stole the void, a body that was supposed to say. Dyslexia, great. Void, maybe. And disciples, guess what? Didn't believe in the resurrection even when they saw the empty tomb. They ran and hid. They believed in the resurrection when they saw Jesus. So even if they went to the wrong tomb, it doesn't do anything to the bedrock facts that we have. What about the alien theory? We're going to be talking about more about this stuff next week. Mark's going to help me out with the mental health at the end there. Raise your hand, Mark. There he is. One, even you say aliens took Jesus' body out of the tomb. Okay, that doesn't deny the resurrection. Only that God is the cause. Not only top, the life of Jesus differs substantially from typical alien accounts, which we'll go into the cultic experiences next time we meet. On top of that, we have very, 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 very strong evidence that aliens do not exist. And I'll talk about that next time. Very strong evidence. And I always love this one. They go, well, I go, what do you mean by alien? Well, someone not from this planet. Okay, so Jesus? God came down and took on human form. Like, what are we talking about here? There's good evidence that God exists. And this God, metaphysically, is vastly different from every single alien account ever recorded, even in Blue Book projects. And that's the God that Jesus testified to. This doesn't seem to fit the data. And we'll talk about more about this theory next time. My favorite, and the worst, is the hallucination theory. This one is still popularized today. They basically said all the disciples, all the 500, every time Jesus appeared, it was just a group mass hallucination. First of all, there is not one peer-reviewed study ever that can be found in the literature that has shown that the group hallucinations experience the same hallucination. There just isn't. A lot of people, I'm sure those who lived through the 70s could say that a lot of people hallucinated together in groups. But they didn't meet together and eat together and share the same hallucination as everyone in the room. There is no evidence ever found that that has been experienced, and they've tried. Doesn't explain that. Doesn't explain the empty tomb, or Paul, or James. And there's way too many variances and situations that hallucinations cannot explain, such as tangibly eating food with the hallucination. Tangibly touching the hallucination and experience that. The hallucination theory, I think, needs to just be thrown in the garbage, but somehow it keeps coming back up. So as you can see, these theories don't hold a candle to the resurrection hypothesis. It doesn't have power. They don't have scope. A lot of them are ad hoc. It doesn't illuminate everything else. And so still, the resurrection of Jesus is the best answer from everything we have, and continues to be the best answer for more evidence that keeps coming out through archaeology and historical manuscripts. So no wonder why I think Jesus rose from the dead. So here's the conversation. Why Christianity? Well, I think Jesus historically rose from the dead. Come on, really? I mean, that's a verbatim from someone I've heard before. Come on. Yeah. Listen, as a historical claim, we can look at the surrounding historical information. And we can discover and seek to see what is the best explanation that fits all of the data that we have. And we have bedrock facts that everyone, whether Christian or atheist, believe is historical. Yet no explanation fits the data like the resurrection does. Therefore, the resurrection is the answer that best explains everything that we know of. So I'm perfectly rational to think that Jesus rose from the dead. That make sense? God exists, and then Jesus rose from the dead. And the last and third topic, make sure, perfect, is we can trust the Gospels. Like I said, just for the sake of time, I'm going to talk about a little bit on the Gospel. You'll see it kind of like reach into the New Testament in general, but I want to concentrate on the Gospels for a second. I want to give you two main points. The second one might scare you. Stick with me through it. Let me explain it all. It scared me many, many years ago, and I started diving into it, and you're realizing it actually shows a lot more than you don't think, that you really don't realize it does, and how trustworthy what we have in our hands actually is. So the first category is this: the early recognition by the apostolic fathers for the Gospels. Now, let's define what I mean by that. The apostolic fathers are early church fathers, but they're the earliest of church fathers. They are the church fathers who had personal knowledge of, by, and through the apostles themselves, but weren't the apostles. They were the apostolic fathers. They were basically the crew after the apostles. And that ranges between 30 and 150 AD. So, I mean, they were alive even when Jesus was still walking the earth. And so here's the claim I'm going to show briefly. The apostolic fathers quoted, paraphrased, and showed acquaintance with either the writing or oral formulations of the actual apostles' writings themselves. Meaning that the apostles' authority was recognized as reliable and desired information for the historical Jesus. And it's incredible what we have and what we found about this. I'm just going to give you 3 examples. Let's give you quick 3 examples. Clement of Rome. He lived in 35 to 99 AD, and he wrote 2 main letters, First Clement and Second Clement. He was the 4th pope of the church. According to Tertullian, an early church historian during this time frame, Saint Peter, so Peter, consecrated Clement of Rome himself as the pope. And Irenaeus lists him as a contemporary, sitting underneath the apostles and hearing their preaching. Like Peter consecrated him as pope. Like, that's crazy to think about. This is what Clement writes himself. Especially remember the words of our Lord Jesus, which he spoke when teaching gentleness and long-suffering. For he spoke thus: Be merciful, that you may obtain mercy. Forgive, that you may be forgiven. And do unto others, so shall it be done to you. As you give, you shall be given to you. As you judge, you shall be judged. And as you show kindness, so shall kindness be shown to you. With what measure you measure, it shall be measured to you. He quotes Matthew 5 and Luke 6. Fascinating. Meaning, we have the letters that he knew of personally of Matthew and Luke. He also quotes Mark, 1 Corinthians, Romans, Hebrews, and more. He finds paraphrases of Acts, James, and 1 Peter. So all of these were paraphrased and quoted for him before 99 AD. Let me give you Ignatius of Antioch. He was the 2nd bishop of Antioch and also a successor of Peter, because Peter roamed around a lot. He was a personal friend of the Apostle John. He said so himself. I'm John's friend. He knew Paul personally as well. He wrote several letters and referenced several letters. 1 Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians. He also quoted and paraphrased from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he died in 107 AD. According to Dr. Simbinga, Ignatius was even quoted, ready for this? This is fascinating, especially when you get into a lot of scholarship out there, with the oral traditions of the church that Paul quotes from way before the gospel writings. He quotes from early formulaic that the early church quoted from that was then referenced in the apostles' writings themselves. What is called M material, a pre-Matthean formula. So we have this man who was Peter knew, friend of John, friend of Paul, quoted all these letters, all the Gospels as well, and he said he was familiar and quoted from early oral formulas that the Gospels themselves used.
You mean he wrote about those letters?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't jump ahead. Papias. Papias in his own letter said, I sought out Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, John, and Matthew himself to figure out what the gospel was and what they were writing. Irenaeus, in his letter, talked about Papias and that he sat and heard John preach and was a friend of Polycarp, who was the personal disciple chosen by John. He learned of the Gospels and the resurrection personally from Philip's daughters, that is found in Acts. And he was the one that we found in his writings that said, guess what? We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all in Greek, but guess what? Matthew wrote a letter first in Hebrew that I know. It's lost to us. We don't know what it is, but Matthew also wrote a first letter in Hebrew that he knows and references. Mark states this. Papias states this about Mark, having known him personally. John Mark, he was witness to him being the jotter down or the writer of Peter's letters. So we say, well, who's Mark? Well, that's Peter's testimony. Guess what? Papias was testimony to the fact that that was the case. And guess what? Who he was friends with and who he sought out information for? The apostles themselves, right? He also quotes from John, 1 Peter, 1 John, the Apocalypse, which is Revelation, that's what they call it back then, and Matthew. When we look at just the earliest of church fathers, here's a chart for you. Earliest, within the first 200 years, they quote or paraphrase the Gospels almost 20,000 times. And if you want to go even more, here is reference to almost all of them and references and quotes that we have from them. We see that the Gospels, my gosh, were quoted from, referenced. Now, don't get me wrong. Though Clement didn't quote 1 Thessalonians, doesn't mean he didn't know of it, right? Don't get that conclusion. But I'm just giving you what we know from the writings that we have. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John established extremely early from the apostles that this was their testimony. Who wrote who helped this, who did this. And this doesn't even get into scribes or any of that fun history that you can go on. It seems from just the apostolic fathers, we have extremely good historical grounds that what we have is what the apostles wrote in the Gospels. Now, last section. Let's talk about manuscript variations, because this is a popular argument against Christianity. Let's talk about this. This seems scary. It did for me. Yep.
So, when did the apostles write most of the New Testament? Like, what years would that have been?
So it depends who you talk to. I think the arguments that everything was before 70 AD have the best arguments for them. They didn't mention the temple being destroyed. They didn't mention all the other history behind it. Which, when you read, how do I say this? When you read the Gospels, they tell the story of Jesus to what was historically happening and needed back then. Like when you read John, and I'll do a talk on this one of these days. John, especially John's prologue, Jesus, the Word of God, there was a huge Gnostic and Docetism belief happening in the church. And I think he deliberately used that prologue to show who Jesus was, to counter historically what was happening to the church. And if this is how they were writing, showing what Jesus was and is and did, through the history that was happening contemporary to them, we have nothing in the Gospels that mentions the temple, the Jewish temple, being destroyed by Antiochus. And it seems very weird that that wouldn't be the case, given what they were doing. So, the big swing of arguments is around before 70 AD for the Gospels. Some people put Revelation 90. I think it can go earlier, given some arguments, but I would say no later than 70 AD. There are really heavy arguments for Mark around 40, which is within 10 years of the actual event. And the Matthew and Hebrew could have been within a few years, and we just don't have the letter. And so it's very early testimony. Plus, like I said, Paul, when you look at a lot of Paul's writings, he quotes all the time oral formulas used by the early church that we have not only established through Scripture, but extra biblical testimony that Paul quotes of what the early church believed about Jesus and what he did, which is very, very fascinating. And Paul's letters, I think, most of them were before the gospel. I think if you read Thessalonians, I think people put Thessalonians end of 40 AD. So I think Paul's can be established a lot earlier than a lot of the gospels, and it's incredible testimony to even what the disciples wrote themselves. So there's a whole that's fun information too. But yeah, I think it's earlier. Some people put like 140. And I'm like, where in the what are you arguing at? Well, their arguments are this one very vague atheistic scholar has this one very unplausible argument. It has nothing to do with anything, and they go, "Well, I put it 200." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And so yeah, which is funny because how then do you have quotes from early church fathers that died in the 100 ADs from these letters? If it was written 200 AD, you know what I mean? That gets into some church conspiracy about the resurrection. Well, then go, why did they all die for it? You know what I mean? Like, why did they all die for it? Poor and beaten and crucified and stoned and hung. Just nonsense to me. So.
When were all the apostles gone? Like when?
Good question.
Not John necessarily, but like all the other ones.
John was an old man. I ironically think John insulted how slow everyone was, and God's I'm gonna make you the slowest one after time done. He's old, just like I can't run anymore. Something I would say by end of 70s, the main Peter, Matthew, and those guys were killed and gone by then.
Why?
That's why I say the majority of.
What makes you think that?
Just the extra biblical testimony that we have of when people died. Like people think Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't want to die like Jesus. That's brutal. So there's a lot of extra biblical church history that gives me clues to they died relatively around that age. Okay, good question though. Great question. Okay, this seems scary, nature of manuscript, but don't worry. There are vast fields of scholarly research out there, two in particular that I like studying. It's called source criticism and textual criticism. Source criticism is to look into, real simply, basically where the manuscripts came from. We can tell language, where they were found, the kind of paper, how they were written, the kind of paper they were on, what region of what particular area, the dating, and how manuscripts sort of traveled throughout the area to where they landed. There's really good scholarly material on this. This paper was created here, so if it was written on this paper, it has to be later than this time, right? If it was in this type of language, it wasn't of the earliest, and this is where the language originated, stuff like that. And so we can tell a lot of information about these early manuscripts. Textual criticism looks at sort of the variations of the manuscripts and tries to get back to the original writings of the apostles. So, I'm sure the huge argument you guys often hear, and it's so popular on social media, is that we can't know what the original apostles said. We cannot know. Right? We have all of these variations, and that word is hilarious to me if we can't know, and I'll get into that argument in a second. We have all these variations. How can we know what they actually originally wrote? Now, there's a category error here. There's a difference between the recognition of variations and the effects of variations. Does that make sense? For instance, I could write the cat ran and put T-E-H. You're not going to be like, oh, Jesus can't spell. Well, right? So I'll get into some of those examples. And this does nothing to speak to the importance of the nature of letters, how letters were written, how letters were dictated, the professional field of scribes, where scribes were located, how much were these scribes cost, how the scribes traveled and gave letters, how the church kept... I mean, there's all different fields that we can talk about. So just because you go, oh, there's a variation, we don't need to be scared because there's a vast amount of information out there to show us that we can actually believe we have what they actually wrote. So, let's talk about these variations and differences. There are three things I want to talk about. What is the number of the variants in all of the manuscripts? See how I phrase that? How many differences do we have? What is the nature of these variants? That's a different thing. How many versus the nature of them? Like, what does it do to our knowledge of what was actually written? And third, what are the theological issues at stake? Let's dance into the first one. Daniel Wallace, one of the world's leading textual critics, Christian. He actually, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong, he wasn't, and then he began this field and became a Christian, if I'm not mistaken. He writes this: a textual variation is any place among the manuscripts, any place, in which there is a variation in any way. Wording, word order, omission, added words, different spellings. The most trivial changes count. So, if all of a sudden we have the word cat spelled C-A-T-T, and it's in 1,500 different manuscripts 300 years later, guess what? We're adding that up to the number. You can see how quickly you can add up, how a stupid little dyslexia mistake can add to thousands of different variations. Does that make sense? So, according to today, in all of the manuscripts that we have, by this definition of variation, there's about 300,000 in the New Testament. 300,000. And now that looks scary, but guess what? That's actually very positive for me. And I'll show you why. First, we have to realize the reason why we have all of these is because we have so many manuscripts. I mean, so many manuscripts. It's not that we have one or two, right? Like a lot of the ancient texts that we have, where like you have Odysseus, right? And they're like, oh, we can trust this as the actual writer. Why? There's like two. And you're saying I can't trust the gospel when we have tens of thousands? Very weird, right? Dr. Clemens writes this, and I actually took out the vulgarity in his statement, just for being in church. He goes, when speaking of variance, these are statistics alone, and mostly come across to the public as lies. He doesn't say lies. You could probably fill in what word or phrase he actually said there. So let's dive more into the manuscripts that we have. Now, according to what we have found, just the Greek alone, meaning that's the earliest that they were written in, from the very beginning, the Greek alone, we have 5,800 manuscripts. 5,800. Some fragment pieces, but the average Greek New Testament manuscript is 450 pages long, 2.6 million pages of text, and it leaves over hundreds of witnesses of the entire New Testament. We have hundreds of testimonies of everything that we have, just in the Greek manuscripts. And after that, very early, it was translated in Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Gothic, Ethiopic, Armenian. Just in the Latin, after the Greek, we have 10,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. Today, we have roughly over 23,000 manuscripts found of the entire New Testament. Now, let's just say we gather them all into a building, let's burn them all down, and we lose every single one of the manuscripts. Hypothetical, right? Let's not actually do that. Hypothetically, we burn every single manuscript we've ever found. Well, we have the earliest of church fathers who wrote many commentaries. And, we have over 1 million quotations from the New Testament just from the earliest church fathers. Dr. Metzger and Bart Ehrman, a leading agnostic textual critic who goes around and makes a living about variations, writes this in his book. For all our other sources of our knowledge of the text of the New Testament, if they were destroyed, if everything was destroyed, just with the patriotic quotations from their commentaries, it would be sufficient alone to reconstruct practically the entire New Testament. Fascinating. Yet people go around trying to persuade Christians that we have problems with what we know. Interesting, right? I'm not going to say it out loud, but... Now the dating is impressive. Within the first 300 years of what we have found, dating back, we have 124 manuscripts. That means the entire New Testament, within 300 years, in the Greek, is found multiple times over in all of the manuscripts. Tertullian, who was an ancient church historian, roughly around, I think he died around like 150, somewhere around there. This is what he writes when referencing manuscripts from the early apostles. Are you ready for this? Come now, you who would indulge a better curiosity, if you would apply it to the business of your salvation, run over to the apostolic churches, in which their authentic writings are read, uttering the voice and representing the face of each of them severally. Dr. Wallace writes this in the Latin. He uses the word authentic. Tertullian seems to be saying then that several of the original apostles' New Testament books still existed to his days in their original churches that you could come, read, and copy from. He also mentions the letters of Paul in Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Ephesus, and Rome. All the letters are still there. That was mid-2nd century. Fascinating. And once again, I didn't mention how scribes were used to copy manuscripts and all that, and how that was worked. It's quite fascinating. All the evidence we have of why we should think things are great, right? So let's talk about the nature of variants. Because I'm going to be honest with you, there are variants in all of our manuscripts. People have made mistakes. But let's talk about these mistakes. Because you're going to find very quickly, they shouldn't scare you. There's four different sort of natures to it. The first is this. There's spelling differences and nonsense errors. Spelling differences and nonsense errors. For instance, dyslexia was alive and well back then. It wasn't a mental health thing where people said, hey, you have a problem, you're mixing up words, you're mixing up letters. It was alive and well, even way back then. The second category is minor differences that affect the translation, but hear me out. That do not affect the translation because synonyms are used. Like if I say Paul laughed or Paul chuckled, and that's in 1,000 different manuscripts 300 years later, guess what? 1,000 variations. That's how they count them. The third is there are differences that affect the meaning of the text, but aren't viable. And what they mean by that is they're so late in dating, like in the medieval times, that we know they aren't original because thousands of manuscripts prior don't have that variation. They're not viable. And there's a difference, but we know they don't work. We know they're old, we throw them away, we recognize them. And the last category is there's an affects the meaning, and there's still an argument over which is the original text. Now, don't get me wrong. It just isn't, well, we don't know, because that's not how it works. It's, we know with a high degree of probability or high degree of plausibility which it is, but there's still an argument among the scholars on what it is. The first three categories is solidified basically universally by agnostics and Christians alike what the actual text states. Let's give examples of each category. Category 1 and 2. In 1 Thessalonians 2:7, there are some manuscripts that state, we were gentle among you. There are some that states, we were little children among you. The difference in the Greek is one letter that looks identical. Where you can see, oh, was that an I or an L? Does that make sense? Like in our writing, was that an I or was that a little L? I don't know what it is. The person's handwriting wasn't as good. Now, how do we know which is which? Well, the earliest manuscripts by far always state it was gentle among you. The later ones say we were little children among you. So we have reasons to think gentle is the case. On top of that, the context immediately after in every manuscript is identical. It states this, like mothers breastfeeding their children. So, not only do the earliest say we are gentle among you, think about this context. We were little children among you, like mothers breastfeeding my children. What? Do you see where I'm going? See how that works? So they go, okay, well, the earliest say this. The context doesn't make any sense. And everything universally after states the same. We know they meant gentle among you. Because for 100 years, we have this all manuscript set. What's even funnier, in the medieval manuscripts, like centuries later, it states we were horses among you. Why? Because the letters are identical and can change the words up that easily in the Greek. But they throw that out because it's like 1,000 years later. Another example they like to give is the idea of Jesus loves John, where you can use different synonyms. In the Greek, Daniel Wallace points this out. The literal translation to the English is always and only Jesus loved John, but you can write that in the Greek 16 different ways. And if it's written 16 different ways in 1,000 different manuscripts, you have a lot of different variations, even though it says the identical thing. You can start to see how it adds up, and just because there's a spelling error or a synonym, we can still know what the original was, even when they all agree. The third category, meaningful but not viable. We know it's later and not authentic. Let me tell you why. Example, 1 Thessalonians 2:9. We find in the medieval times variations starting to say the gospel of Christ instead of the gospel of God. But for 1,000 years and thousands of manuscripts prior, it has only and always been the gospel of God. And randomly, we have this variation saying the gospel of Christ appears, and we know where it appeared. We have references in the manuscript of dating the kind of paper, so we know that's not viable because it's 1,000 years later, and everything before that said this is what it has always been. So something went wrong in that scribe's translation and looking at the letters. But we still know what it actually said, even though we have a variation. Does that make sense? In the fourth category, meaningful and viable. Now, all of our Bibles should have these footnoted. Have you guys read your footnotes as you go through the Bible? This means it can change the meaning of the text, and there's still a little argument about what is actually the original wording. Let me give you two examples. Revelation 13:18. Let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, there's been a manuscript found in the medieval times with certain language on certain paper that state that this man's name and number should be 616. So for years, the argument has always been it should be 666. But a few years ago, and this roughly just happened, a few years ago, in Oxford University, they found a manuscript out of the thousands they have, they're working through them, that give the number 616. And it is the earliest manuscript that we have of this passage. So, the earliest one, but only one of the earliest, when everything else says 666. And so there's still a debate. I still favor 666 given the references of early church fathers and how they quoted certain things. But scholars are not all in agreement on what it is. What does it change? Well, it doesn't change any core doctrine to me. Because you're going to find category 4 doesn't change any core doctrines. What it changes is someone stopping making a living trying to calculate 666. That's what it changes. Let me give you another example. John 7:53, 8 through 11. The woman caught in adultery, all know that story. Every Bible worth their weight in salt has it either in the footnotes or in the column that this was not in the earliest manuscripts. Or it says this. Mine, the ESV states this. The earliest manuscripts do not include. Earliest church fathers never reference this passage. And we find them later on in manuscripts. So, if we go, well, that wasn't actually originally in there, what does this change? Nothing. We just have 1,000 stories of Jesus' greatness and justice and mercy. We just take one away. What it changes is the need for pastors to be more upfront about the passages they're using. It doesn't change any doctrine of Jesus. It doesn't change anything else. Everything else we have in the Gospels is exactly identical. But you can see how that fourth category can scare people. But once again, when you look at the fourth category, you'll see them footnoted in your Bibles because they will say there's still discussion about this. Now, look what Bach and Wallace write about this. Less than 1/5 of 1% of all variants fall into the fourth category. All of the other ones are in the top 3 and are agreed what the original are. Now, I'm going to show you something even cooler. In that email you have, there is this website I attached done by Dr. Wallace. It's called the Center for Studies of New Testament Manuscripts, and this is game-changing. What he has done... Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So this is the variants of the books that we have, but of course they picked books that would all match each other? Like, so how was what was selected?
Oh, that's a whole different. What made
why?
The canon is a different category. All I want to concentrate on is the Gospels, because all the canons throughout church history, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, unanimously. So
Okay.
that's a whole other topic for another period. But does that make sense? How it became canon is different than the historicity of the Gospels.
Okay.
You started a wormhole on that one, Sarah.
I know.
So this website, like I said, is a game changer, and it's free for anyone. What they have done, and they're continuously doing, they're going around to every single place that has every single of the tens of thousands of manuscripts, and they're recording it for everyone to look at. And so you can go through the classifications, the contents, the features. Let me just give you this one. We'll go this one, 3rd century. You can see photos, what it looks like,
Oh, that's so
and they
cool.
classify every single one. The amount of scholarship, because people don't have to fly to Egypt or fly to Italy, and all of the information coming out and more. I mean, it's fascinating how much more like grounded of what we have actually is. Because these scholars can look in their office, zoom in, get references. It tells you all of the dating, tells you the references. This is parts of Jeremiah 4 from the 2nd century.
Oh, that's amazing.
And they're categorizing and cataloging everything for everyone to see. And so when I go, well, that doesn't compare to that, they can go, all right, let's look at this. And they can do it from their home office. And so the amount of work coming out is fascinating on people filling in the gaps of the missing parts and what it actually is saying, and compare, like, wow, look at that. That just testified to the original again. It's incredible. For those who have the email, I put the link right in it. You can just click on it and it goes right to it. You can look at it yourself. That's just a fun little fact there. Let me give you some more quotes here. Dr. Wallace writes, the very fact that Ehrman and other textual critics can place these textual variants in history, listen to the logic of this, and can determine the original text was corrupted, presupposes the authentic wording has hardly been lost. Think about this logic. You're telling me these variations corrupt the original. If we don't have the original, how do you know they can corrupt it? Think about that argument. Well, these variations, they changed it from the original. Okay, then tell me what they changed it from. Well, they changed it from here. Okay, then I have the original. You see the logic of that argument? If you're telling me they change it, then you're telling me I know what they changed it from. It is one thing to argue we can never know, but that is not the essence of the argument. The argument is they've made changes, the variations pointed out, and we cannot know, and we can't even know their changes. He quotes this. The idea, and there's a misconfusion here, the idea that 1% of the New Testament, actually 1/5 of 1%, right, is disputed is slightly misleading. This doesn't mean we have 99% of the original. Instead, we have 105. That is, the originals is somewhere in there. And the scholars are discerning which is the original. You see the difference there? It's not that we haven't found it. We have way more. And that's very small percent we're arguing over which the disciples actually wrote. The other percentages, everyone's going, yeah, yeah, sure. That's great. That's what I think they have. Bart Ehrman himself, I think his last book says he believes we have 99.8% of the original writings. Yet he makes a living going around arguing all these variations, and we should never know. Fascinating. But once you dive into this, and you look into this, and sure that there's that 4th category that we're still arguing with, but there's plausibility to all the arguments, and they don't affect any doctrine that we have. It's the peripheral things. You can't find one in the 4th that affects our doctrine. You go, wow, yeah.
What about Mark 16 additions there?
Yeah, the ending of Mark.
Yeah.
So I would say, it depends who you talk to. Like Mike Lacona, I just had him on the podcast. He thinks that's original. There's different arguments to what it is. I still would argue that just adds information. It doesn't change any doctrine. So it just adds additional information at the end of Mark of additional testimony to what we already have, if that makes sense. So, but I haven't made my mind up yet on that, to just be honest with you. But still, if that's what I haven't made my mind up on yet.
Do you have an example of a nonsense error?
Yeah, the nonsense error would be within these First Thessalonians 2:7. The letter was flip-flopped. Yeah, it's just sort of like, okay, we know what it was. That's why I said dyslexia was alive and well. There's a lot where it's, like I said, if we put the English word the, it's T-E-H. When all of them say the, we know what word it is. Or when they say, another example, I forgot what it's from, but they'll say Jonathan, she. But all the other ones say he. Well, we know back then Jonathan's a he. And so it's like, okay, they mixed up when they're transposing. It clearly back then it's a he, right? And so, what?
Maybe.
What's the part in Mark that he's referring to?
The ending of Mark.
Refresh me.
So, let me pull that up.
So we don't have to go into it. I just don't. If you.
So there's the ending of Mark. They don't know if it was a late edition or original, but it's marked in my Bible that there's still arguments on what it is.
Would that change the gospel message?
No,
okay.
not whatsoever. It just adds an extra additional information.
To tell stuff about handling snakes.
Yeah. Which is funny because I always laugh. People are walking around with snakes. I'm like, did you read the very next sentence? It says you can drink poison too. So you're fine playing with snakes. I don't see you drinking poison in church. Like, why do you choose one or the other? Like, do both. What's happening here? So, but yeah, I don't know. I haven't made my mind up. We'll put it that way. So let's go back. So here's the conversation. Why Christianity? I think we can trust the Gospels. I'm reading as the true eyewitness account of Jesus' life and death of the resurrection. Why? We have all these variations. Well, the early apostolic fathers who knew of and learned from the disciples used to recognize that these were their original writings. And we have thousands of manuscripts we can source from. Lastly, the manuscripts are identical in all of the majors and slight variances in the minors. And the history of these variances is well known and understood as variations to the original, since we can compare thousands of them for over the centuries. I believe God exists. I believe Jesus rose from the dead. And the New Testament Gospels are historically reliable. So I think this is a good 1, 2, 3 punch for you guys. With some more information in beneath. If someone asks you, the wise acre that goes, well, give me more, right? In the conversation. Why you are a Christian. Not only do you have your personal testimony, which you should always be prepared, but as you saw the statistics of where it's going, this is great, but it's a both-and situation. And we are commanded in Scripture to be able to do this other part as well. And a lot of times this gets overlooked. Whether it be in churches, whether it be in small groups, whether it be just in normal conversations with friends. We need to be able to go, this is what he's done for me, and I know it's true. Also, because look at what the history and science and archaeology has all shown me to be true of reality. And once you get this, and you get this put together, you're going to see, I think it does wonders. And I think it has done really great effects in people that I talk to in my life when it comes to proclaiming why I believe Christianity is actually true of the world. Do you guys have any thoughts? Questions?
Would the argument number one be that a God exists, and then the second point be that that's why the Christian God exists?
Sure, yes. I first want to establish that we have this creator of the universe. And then as soon as you go, like I said in the resurrection, what did he say? Well, he said this. This is who God is. This is his Father. This is this. And you go, okay, dude, you just told me you're going to die and rise from the dead. I'm going to kind of believe what you told me. Right? And plus it's an ancient belief system too. And we have all of the history and archaeology that's fascinating that we're finding of the old Jewish belief as well. So we have all of that we could talk about, adding more and more weight to the cumulative case of why Christianity is true. Because I believe the Old Testament Judaism is true as a Christian. And so we could talk about that as well. So that's why I believe Christianity is true, and hopefully it's a good sort of thing you can memorize. I know there's a lot, but even if you memorize the 1, 2, 3 punch, most people will not be expecting you to even have an answer to that in this day and age. So, next month, Joanne, she wanted the first one. Next month,
Ready to clap, yeah.
we have a very fun, fascinating, it's called The Christian and E.T. I'm going to be talking about aliens from the Christian worldview. And my man Mark over here, you want to
Raise your hand again.
raise your hand? If my conclusion is correct on what I think is actually happening out there, and I will argue that it is, we're going to bring in Mark at the end to talk about how as Christians we can, through mental health in our mind, guard ourselves to what people are experiencing and going through in this world when it comes to these encounters. Because I think it's very demonic. And I have really good evidence to think that is the case. And I think Ancient Aliens as a show is kind of crazy. And so, yeah, I appreciate you guys coming and the call. But like I said, this kind of survey of the topic